My name is Nia. I am 29 years old, working as a wealth management consultant, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. Half a year after my wedding, my mother-in-law leaned across the Sunday dinner table and declared that the apartment I shared with her son belonged to the family now. She demanded I pay her $2,700 in rent every single month. I simply sipped my sweet tea, smiled, and said I would just move back to my apartment. My husband froze, asking what apartment I was talking about. He had no clue what I had been hiding. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth and tried to bleed you dry. Sunday dinners at Brenda House were an institution. The dining room was always suffocatingly warm, smelling of collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, and fried chicken. But the warmth of the food never matched the temperature of the room. Brenda, my mother-in-law, ruled her domain with an iron fist, wrapped in a velvet church glove. I sat quietly next to my husband, Jamal. Jamal was a 32-year-old entrepreneur, or at least that is what his social media profile claimed. In reality, his tech startup was bleeding money, and I was the one keeping our finances afloat. I had married him because he was charming, smooth-talking, and presented himself as a king building his empire. I wanted to be his queen, the supportive wife standing by her man. But lately, the crown felt more like a heavy yoke dragging me down into the mud. Across the table sat Keisha, Jamal's 27-year-old sister. Keisha was currently deeply invested in pretending to be a lifestyle influencer. She wore designer clothes she could not afford, carried bags that cost more than her rent, and constantly complained about the stress of content creation. Brenda treated her like a fragile princess who needed constant saving. I, on the other hand, was the workhorse, the reliable, strong woman who was supposed to endure everything without a single complaint. The ambush came right after we finished eating. Brenda tapped her fork against her crystal wine glass. The sharp clinking sound silenced the room immediately. She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin, cleared her throat, and fixed her gaze directly on me. Nia, Brenda began using her sweetest, most dangerous tone. "We need to talk about family business. You know we are all incredibly proud of your little career in wealth management. God has blessed you with a good mind for numbers. But with blessings come responsibilities." I set my fork down, a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. I asked her exactly what she meant by that statement. Brenda folded her hands on the table and let out a heavy sigh. "Jamal has been telling me about the financial stress he is under with his startup. A man carries a heavy burden trying to build a legacy for his family. And poor Keisha here is struggling. Her credit cards are maxed out and she needs to maintain her image for her brand sponsorships. Family is all we got, Nia. We have to lift each other up. So I have made a decision about the luxury apartment you and Jamal are living in right now." I looked at Jamal, expecting him to intervene. He was intensely focused on his half-empty glass of sweet tea, completely avoiding my eyes. "That apartment belongs to the family now," Brenda declared smoothly, as if she were reading announcements at Sunday service. "Since Jamal is the head of your household and I am the head of this family, we need to restructure things. Starting the 1st of next month, you will deposit $2,700 directly into my checking account as rent. I will use that money to help Keisha pay off her debts and support Jamal's business. It is your duty to hold your family down when times get tough. You make good money, so you need to do your part." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. I waited for the punchline, for the nervous laughter that follows a bad joke. But nobody laughed. Keisha smirked, checking her long acrylic nails. Jamal still refused to look at me. I turned to my husband, my voice low and steady. "Jamal, are you hearing this? Are you going to say something to your mother?" Jamal finally lifted his head. He gave me that familiar, practiced smile, the one he used when he wanted to smooth things over and get his way. "It is just family business, babe," he said softly, reaching across the table for my hand. "We look out for our own. You make good money at the firm. You know my startup is just months away from a massive breakthrough. Mom is just trying to make sure everyone stays afloat until my investors come through. You are my rock, Nia. You always hold it down for us." He was manipulating me right in front of his mother and sister. He was using the very expectations that destroy so many women in our culture. The expectation that I had to be the mule, the savior, the endless source of physical and financial labor, all while accepting disrespect with a pleasant smile. Keisha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute entitlement. Honestly, Nia, you should be happy to help your new family. You are always working anyway. You do not even have time to enjoy your money. Speaking of which, I have a brand trip to Miami next weekend. I am going to need an advance on that rent money you owe Mom. Oh, and I want to borrow that vintage designer bag of yours. It would look perfect on my feed. I looked around the table at these people who felt completely entitled to my sweat, my intelligence, and my resources. For 6 months of marriage, I had played the supportive wife. I had paid the bills, funded Jamal's business trips, and endured Brenda's passive-aggressive comments about how I worked too much and did not cook enough traditional meals. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my patience for stupidity. They thought because I loved Jamal, I would let them bleed me dry without a fight. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the angry, emotional reaction they were fully prepared to weaponize against me. Instead, I calmly picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly on the table. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and smiled at my mother-in-law. That sounds like a wonderful plan for your family, Brenda, I said pleasantly. But if you are taking over the lease and charging rent, then I will just move back to my apartment. The smug satisfaction on Brenda's face faltered instantly. Keisha stopped inspecting her nails and stared at me. Jamal froze completely, his hand still suspended in the air where he had tried to hold mine. What apartment? Jamal asked, his voice suddenly sharp, the charming facade cracking into pieces. You sold your downtown condo before the wedding. You put the money into our joint account to help fund my startup. I turned my body to face him, fully maintaining my pleasant, unwavering smile. Did I asked softly. Jamal's eyes widened in horror. He was a man who prided himself on control, on knowing exactly how to manipulate the women in his life. The realization that he had missed something massive was visibly short-circuiting his brain. I never sold the condo, Jamal, I explained, keeping my tone as casual as if we were discussing the weather outside. I am a wealth management consultant. My entire job is protecting assets from bad investments. Before we got married, I transferred the deed of the luxury downtown condo into a blind, limited liability company that I entirely control. The money I put into your business was just a portion of my annual bonus and some old stock liquidations. The condo is currently sitting empty waiting for me. I never gave up my sanctuary. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Brenda stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Keisha dropped her phone onto her plate. You lied to your husband. Brenda shouted, her dignified church lady persona completely vanishing. You hid property from the man supposed to lead your household. What kind of deceitful, wicked woman does that? A smart one, I replied, standing up and smoothing my skirt. A woman who knows better than to hand over the keys to her kingdom to a man who still lets his mother handle his financial conflicts. Jamal's face twisted with pure rage. He slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware rattle against the plates. You are my wife. What is yours is mine. We are supposed to be building an empire together. You let me stress about funding while you had $1 million asset just sitting there hidden away. I looked at him with absolute disdain. You are not building an empire, Jamal. You are playing businessman on the internet while I foot the bill for your lifestyle. And Brenda, you want rent? Good luck getting it from your son's failing company. I am done playing the sacrificial lamb for a family of parasites. I turned my back on them and walked toward the front door. The sounds of their screaming followed me down the hallway. Brenda was yelling about biblical submission and respect. Keisha was whining about her ruined Miami trip. Jamal was shouting my name, demanding I come back and show him some respect as his wife. I ignored all of it. I grabbed my coat and my purse, feeling lighter than I had in 6 months of marriage. When I reached my car, my phone started vibrating furiously. It was Jamal blowing up my texts with a mixture of threats, demands, and pathetic apologies. I blocked his number as I started the engine. I needed to go back to the apartment we shared, pack my essential belongings, and get out before he arrived and tried to stop me physically. The drive back to our shared place was a blur of adrenaline and clarity. I practically ran inside, pulling my large suitcase from the closet. I did not care about the furniture or the kitchen appliances we had bought together. I only cared about my clothes, my jewelry, my financial documents, and my work laptop. I threw everything into the suitcase with ruthless efficiency, my mind already calculating my next legal moves to secure my complete independence. Just as I was zipping up the final bag, my phone rang again. This time, it was not Jamal. It was a number I had saved, but rarely ever answered. The name flashing on the screen made my blood run cold. Moesha. My mother. My mother and I had a strained, toxic relationship for as long as I could remember. She was a master manipulator, a woman who always played the victim and demanded endless gratitude for raising me as a single mother. I had maintained low contact with her for years to protect my peace and my sanity. Jamal knew this better than anyone. He knew Moesha was my weak spot, the one person in the world who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to make me doubt myself. If Jamal was calling Moesha, it meant he was truly desperate. He had realized his charm and his anger were no longer working on me, so he had outsourced the manipulation to the true master. He knew Moesha would stop at nothing to drag me back into submission. As the phone continued to vibrate in my hand, the harsh buzzing echoing in the quiet bedroom, I realized this was no longer just a bad marriage ending. This was a coordinated attack from all sides, and the walls were closing in rapidly. I stared at the glowing screen, taking a deep breath, preparing myself for the psychological warfare that was about to begin. I let the phone ring out. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase, the wheels rolling smoothly over the hardwood floor. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, primitive rhythm, echoing the anxiety spiking in my mind. I needed to get to my car drive out of the city and disappear into a secure hotel until my lawyers could file the separation papers. I navigated the hallway, my mind racing through the legal maneuvers required to untangle my finances from Jamal. I reached the elevator, pressed the button for the parking garage, and stepped inside. The heavy metal doors slid shut, sealing me in a temporary pocket of safety. When the elevator chimed at the garage level, I stepped out into the damp, echoing concrete space. I popped the trunk and hoisted my heavy suitcase inside. Just as I slammed the trunk shut, the screech of tires echoed through the garage. A silver SUV sped down the ramp and swerved aggressively, braking just inches from my rear bumper. The vehicle completely blocked my car in the parking spot. I recognized the silver SUV. It belonged to my mother, Moesha. Moesha threw her door open and marched toward me. She wore her Sunday best, a tailored lavender suit and a wide-brimmed church hat. But her eyes blazed with an unholy fury. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "What kind of absolute foolishness are you pulling tonight, Nia?" she demanded, her tone dripping with the manufactured authority she used to dominate every church committee meeting. Jamal called me in tears. He said you disrespected him, embarrassed his family, and threatened to leave your marriage over some selfish financial dispute. I stood my ground, gripping my car keys. I told her Jamal was a fraud who expected me to finance his life while his mother demanded rent from my paycheck. Moesha scoffed, stepping closer. "You are a wife now, Nia. A black woman's highest calling is holding her family together. You think you are better than everyone because you play with rich people's money. I sacrificed my entire life for you. I did that because your father died a broke addict in the streets. He abandoned us. I was the one who stayed. I am the reason you have that fancy job. And this is how you repay my sacrifices, by destroying your own home." Her words were a practiced weapon sharpened by years of use. She framed her toxicity as maternal protection. "I am not destroying my home," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "I am protecting my hard-earned assets. Jamal is using me. His company is a financial black hole." Right then, another car sped into the garage. Jamal jumped out, breathing heavily, looking desperate and enraged. He hurried over to stand next to my mother. They formed a physical wall between me and the exit ramp. "Nia, please," Jamal pleaded, switching to a soft, victimized tone. "I just want us to build our legacy. You are being irrational. You need to sign the downtown condo over to my company's holding account. It will save our marriage. It will secure our future." Moesha nodded vigorously. "Listen to your husband right now, Nia. Sign the papers. Sign that property over to Jamal right now, and we can all go upstairs and pray on this situation. A chilling realization washed over me. I looked at Jamal, then at my mother. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Moisha absolutely hated Jamal when we first started dating. Yet here she was in a damp parking garage aggressively demanding that I sign a multi-million-dollar real estate asset over to a man she used to despise. Why would she care if Jamal's startup succeeded? Why would she care about my marriage when she historically destroyed every relationship I ever built? She was not just being a toxic mother, she was actively conspiring with him. They were working together. My chest tightened as the depth of the betrayal became apparent. I did not know the exact mechanics of their partnership yet, but the financial consultant in me recognized a coordinated shakedown when I saw one. I looked Moesha dead in the eye and sliced right through her heavy guilt-tripping. "I am not signing anything tonight," I stated flatly. "Let us talk about cold, hard facts." I continued, "Jamal has no revenue. I reviewed his cap tables last month. His seed money is drying up, his user acquisition cost is astronomical, and his burn rate is completely unsustainable. He is not a tech visionary, he is a parasite. And you, Moesha, you do not care about my soul or my marriage. You care about control. I do not know what cut you are getting out of this condo deal, but the answer is absolutely no." Moesha's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You arrogant, ungrateful little girl," Moesha hissed, stepping so close I could smell the strong mints on her breath. "You will do what I tell you to do. I am your mother, Nia. I own you." Jamal took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are not leaving this garage until we get this sorted out, Nia. You are my wife. You belong upstairs with me." They were cornering me against my car. Jamal shifted his weight, blocking my path to the driver's side door. Moisha stood solidly behind my vehicle, ensuring I could not back out, even if I managed to start the engine. The physical threat was suddenly very real, thick and suffocating in the cold air of the parking garage. I was alone, trapped underground with two people who viewed my bank accounts as their personal salvation. I had to make a split-second calculation. My large suitcase was locked in the trunk. My car was completely immobilized, but I had my essential go bag strapped across my chest, containing my wallet, my identification, my phone, and my most sensitive financial security keys. That one small leather bag was all I truly needed to survive and to fight back. I feigned surrender. I let my shoulders slump, dropping my gaze to the concrete floor. "You are right," I whispered, making my voice tremble slightly. "I am just so stressed. Let me get my laptop from the passenger seat. I can show you the real estate transfer portal." Jamal exhaled heavily, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He took a half step back, relaxing his defensive posture. "I knew you would see reason, babe," he said smoothly, completely falling for the deception. As he shifted his weight, I moved. I did not go for the passenger door. Instead, I spun around, sprinted past the front hood of my car, and darted toward the concrete stairwell located in the dark corner of the garage. "Hey!" Jamal yelled, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly as he scrambled to chase me. "Get back here now!" I slammed through the heavy metal fire door and took the stairs two at a time. The sound of Jamal tearing the door open behind me fueled my adrenaline. I burst out onto the busy downtown street, the cool night air hitting my face. The sudden noise of city traffic provided instant cover. I blended into a large group of people leaving a nearby theater, putting several bodies between myself and the garage exit. I walked swiftly down the block, turned a corner, and immediately hailed a passing yellow cab. I yanked the door open, threw myself into the back seat, and locked the doors tightly. "Take me to the main train station," I instructed the driver. The cab merged into the heavy traffic, carrying me away from the life I had known. My mother and husband had formed an alliance against me. They wanted to strip me of everything I had worked for, but they severely underestimated my absolute resilience and my capacity for ruthlessness. When the cab pulled up to the bustling train station, I handed him cash and hurried inside the Grand Terminal. I avoided the electronic kiosks where a credit card transaction could easily be tracked. Instead, I purchased a one-way ticket on the midnight regional line heading north. I boarded the train just as the final call echoed through the station. The passenger car was mostly empty. I chose a window seat near the back, wrapping my arms tightly around my bag. The train lurched forward, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels providing a strange comfort. Exhaustion finally hit me, a crushing physical weight that settled deep into my bones. I closed my eyes desperately, trying to quiet my racing thoughts. But as the train rattled through the darkness, a heavy, unsettling feeling crept over me. Exhausted on the midnight train, I felt someone watching me. The sensation of being watched is a primal alarm system. It bypasses logic and strikes directly at the nervous system. I opened my eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of the train car forcing me to squint. The carriage was nearly abandoned. A few exhausted commuters slumped against windows miles away, lost in the rhythmic sway of the midnight regional line. But the threat was not miles away. It was sitting exactly one row ahead across the narrow aisle. He was an older black man, perhaps in his late 60s. He sat perfectly upright, his posture rigid and commanding. In a sea of rumpled travel clothes and exhaustion, he looked entirely out of place. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed custom bespoke, paired with a crisp white shirt and a subtly patterned silk tie. A platinum watch caught the overhead light, reflecting a price tag that rivaled my annual salary. He was not a weary traveler. He was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike, and he was staring directly at me. He did not look away when my eyes met his. He did not pretend to be gazing out the window or checking his phone. His focus was absolute, relentless, and completely unnerving. I tightened my grip on the leather strap of my go bag, pressing it firmly against my chest. My mind raced through a dozen terrifying scenarios. Had Jamal sent him? Jamal had connections with unsavory people, men who would gladly track down a fleeing wife for the right price. Or perhaps Moesha had deployed one of her deeply embedded church members to drag me back to the slaughterhouse. I refused to break eye contact. In my line of work, looking away is an admission of weakness. You stare down the threat until you understand its parameters. His face was a mask of weathered experience lined with age, but carved out of granite. His dark eyes were not malicious, but they held a heavy, calculating weight. The silence in the train car stretched, filled only by the mechanical rattling of the wheels against the steel tracks. The digital display above the aisle flashed, announcing our approach to the next station. A mechanized voice crackled through the overhead speakers. The brakes began to squeal, a high-pitched grinding noise that sent a shiver down my spine. The man stood up. My heart hammered against my ribs. I calculated the distance to the emergency exit, the weight of my bag, the likelihood of outrunning him if he lunged. But he did not reach for a weapon. He did not yell. He simply took 2 measured steps across the aisle and slid into the empty seat directly across from me. We were separated by a small, scratched plastic folding table. I pressed my back hard against the window, my muscles coiled and ready to fight. The train continued its slow deceleration. The brakes groaned louder. He leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the table, clasping his large, unadorned hands together. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded instant attention. It was not a threat. It was an inquiry delivered with chilling precision. "Is your mom Moesha?" he asked. The question hit me like a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. Of all the things I expected this stranger to say, my mother's name was absolute last on the list. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me. I lived a highly compartmentalized life. My professional circle in wealth management knew nothing of my toxic mother. Jamal knew her, but Jamal would have sent someone to demand the condo deed, not to ask polite questions about Moesha. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice razor-sharp despite the panic flooding my veins. "How do you know that name?" He did not flinch. He did not offer his name. He simply held my gaze, waiting for the confirmation he already knew was coming. "Yes," I said cautiously, measuring every syllable. "Moesha is my mother. What do you want?" The man let out a slow, measured exhale. The tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, as if he had been carrying a massive weight for decades and was finally allowed to set it down. He reached a hand inside his tailored suit jacket. My fight or flight instinct screamed at me to run, but my curiosity anchored me to the seat. He withdrew a flat rectangular object and placed it face down on the scratched plastic table. He slid it across the surface until it touched the edge of my bag. "I have been looking for you," he whispered. The raw intensity in his voice sent a cold wave crashing over my skin. This was not a hitman. This was not a debt collector sent by Jamal. This was a man haunted by a mission. I looked down at the object. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned it over. It was a photograph. The edges were worn and slightly crumpled, indicating it had been carried in a wallet or breast pocket for many years. The glossy surface was marred by faint fingerprints, but the image itself was perfectly clear. I stared at the photograph, my brain struggling to process the visual data. My stomach dropped so violently I felt physically sick. The girl in the photo was me. There was no denying it. I was looking at my own face captured in the awkward transition of adolescence. I recognized the slight gap in my front teeth that I later had corrected with braces. I recognized the braided hairstyle I wore almost exclusively during my sophomore year of high school. I was wearing a bright yellow sundress, a piece of clothing I distinctly remembered buying at a discount mall with my first summer paycheck. But it was the man standing next to me in the photograph that made the entire world tilt on its axis. He was a tall, striking black man, with a proud, broad-shouldered stance. He wore a bespoke navy suit that draped perfectly across his frame, radiating quiet wealth and immense success. He looked incredibly healthy, his skin glowing with vitality. His left arm was wrapped securely and protectively around my teenage shoulders. We were standing in front of a massive wrought iron gate, flanked by lush manicured gardens, and we were both smiling brightly, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute joy. I dropped the photograph onto the table as if it had burned my fingers. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. I stared at the stranger across from me, my mind fracturing into 1,000 conflicting pieces. "This is fake," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "This is a forgery. Look closer, Nia," the man commanded softly. "Look at the bottom right corner." I forced myself to pick the photograph up again. My thumb brushed against the glossy paper, moving away from the corner. Printed directly onto the photo paper in glowing orange digital ink was a timestamp. August 14th, 2012. The date burned itself into my retinas. I am a wealth management consultant. Numbers are my entire life. I do math instantly, reflexively, without conscious effort. I ran the calculation in my head, and the result shattered my reality into dust. In August of 2012, I was exactly 15 years old. The man in the photo, the man holding me with such fierce paternal pride, shared my exact jawline. He shared the shape of my eyes. He shared the slight curve of my smile. There was absolutely zero doubt about his identity. This man was my father. But that was completely, entirely impossible. Moisha had ingrained the story of my father into my brain since I was old enough to comprehend the concept of death. She had weaponized his memory to ensure my absolute obedience. "Your father was a weak man," Moisha used to tell me, her voice dripping with venom. "He was a broke addict who cared more about his next hit than his own flesh and blood. He died in a filthy alleyway in the year 2000. He abandoned us. He left me to raise you all by myself. I was only 3 years old when my father supposedly overdosed. I had no genuine memories of him." Moesha had shown me the cheap, faded obituary clipping. She had taken me to a depressing, overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of town to stare at a generic headstone. She had played the role of the long-suffering, grieving widow whenever she needed to extract sympathy or money from our church congregation. She had sworn on a Bible that my father died in the year 2000. Yet I was holding a photograph of him looking like a millionaire, looking healthier than anyone I had ever known, and he was standing right next to me. In 2012. 12 full years after Moesha claimed he was put in the ground. My hands shook violently. I stared at the glossy paper, searching my mind, digging frantically through the archives of my own memories. I searched for the yellow dress. I searched for the wrought iron gates. I searched for the feeling of this man's arm around my shoulder. I found absolutely nothing. There was a gaping, terrifying void in my mind. I could remember my high school locker combination. I could remember the name of my geometry teacher. I could remember the constant suffocating pressure of Moesha's rules and regulations during that exact summer. But I had zero memory of taking this photograph. I had zero memory of traveling to this beautiful estate. I had zero memory of meeting my living, breathing father. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. The implications were horrifying. Moesha had not just lied to me about my father being dead. She had not just lied about him being a broke addict. That was standard toxic behavior. This was something far darker. This was something deeply malevolent. I was 15 years old in this picture. I was not a toddler. I was a fully conscious, highly observant teenager. A teenager does not simply forget spending an afternoon with her supposedly dead father. A teenager does not forget taking a photograph with a wealthy man in a tailored suit, unless those memories were forcibly removed. I looked up from the photograph, my eyes locking onto the stranger sitting across from me. He was watching the realization dawn on my face. He saw the exact moment my reality snapped in half. The train finally lurched to a complete stop, the doors sliding open with a heavy mechanical thud, but neither of us moved. We remained frozen in that small train booth, trapped in the gravity of a 12-year-old lie. Who is he? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and mounting rage. And why can I not remember him? His name was Marcus Sterling, the man replied quietly, leaning back against the worn upholstery of the train seat. And my name is Desmond. I am the chief legal counsel and estate executor for his holding company based out of Atlanta. I was your father's attorney, his business partner, and his oldest friend. I stared at him, my mind desperately trying to categorize this information. Atlanta. Real estate. Legal counsel. None of these words aligned with the narrative of a street addict. I demanded he explain himself. I demanded to know how my father went from dying in an alleyway to having an estate executor. Desmond shook his head, a look of profound sorrow passing over his weathered features. Your father never touched a drug in his life, Nia. Marcus was a visionary. He was a highly successful commercial real estate mogul. He built a modest empire from the ground up, revitalizing entire districts in Atlanta. He was brilliant, he was wealthy, and he loved you more than anything in this world. He never abandoned you. Moesha stole you from him. The train rattled over a rough patch of tracks, the carriage swaying violently, mimicking the sudden instability of my entire existence. Moesha had stolen me. I gripped the edge of the table. I told Desmond that made no sense. If my father was so powerful and wealthy, why did he not just come and get me? Why did he let me grow up in a cramped apartment with a mother who treated me like an indentured servant? He spent a fortune trying to find you. Desmond explained, his deep voice cutting through the mechanical hum of the train. When you were 3 years old, Marcus filed for primary custody. He knew Moesha was unstable. He knew she viewed you as a meal ticket rather than a daughter. But before the court could serve the papers, Moesha vanished. She changed her name, moved across the country, and buried her tracks using cash jobs and fake social security numbers. She kept you hidden in the shadows, because keeping you meant keeping the exorbitant child support payments Marcus was forced to put into a blind state account. I looked down at the photograph again. The smiling, healthy man holding me. The timestamp. August 14th, 2012. I traced the digital orange numbers with my fingernail. I asked Desmond the question that was tearing a hole in my sanity. If she hid me so well, how did this picture happen? And why is my mind completely blank? Desmond leaned forward, the sorrow in his eyes hardening into a cold, terrifying anger. Because in 2012, Marcus finally found you. He hired the best private investigators in the country. They tracked Moesha down. Marcus flew here immediately. He waited outside your high school. He approached you. That photograph was taken by a private investigator on the day Marcus took you to lunch to explain the truth. You believed him, Nia. You were so happy. You agreed to testify against Moesha in court so you could come live with him in Atlanta. He immediately filed emergency custody papers. My breathing grew shallow. A sickening panic started to rise in the back of my throat. I remembered my sophomore year of high school. I remembered a sudden, overwhelming fog settling over my brain. I remembered feeling constantly exhausted, sleeping through my classes, stumbling through the hallways like a zombie. Moesha had told everyone I was struggling with the pressure of advanced placement courses. She had taken me to a special doctor. What did she do to me? I whispered, my voice cracking. Desmond closed his eyes for a brief moment. Moesha received the emergency custody summons. She knew she was going to lose you. More importantly, she knew she was going to lose the child support and face criminal charges for custodial interference. So she initiated the most horrific countermaneuver I have ever witnessed in my 30 years of practicing law. Desmond opened his eyes, locking his gaze onto mine. Moesha dragged you to a corrupt psychiatrist, a man she paid in cash. They fabricated a medical history, claiming you were suffering from violent early-onset schizophrenia. She claimed you were having delusions about a rich father coming to save you, and then Nia, she heavily medicated you. She pumped your teenage body full of powerful, mind-altering sedatives and antipsychotics. She kept you chemically lobotomized for 3 straight years. The train car suddenly felt as though it were devoid of oxygen. I grabbed my chest, my fingers digging into my coat. The missing memories. The mental fog. The years I spent doubting my own mind, believing I was naturally defective, believing I owed my mother everything for taking care of me when I was sick. It was all a chemical prison designed to silence me. She drugged me. I gasped. The sheer horror of the reality washing over me. She erased my father to keep her paycheck. She wiped your memory completely, Desmond confirmed grimly. When the custody hearing took place, you could barely string a sentence together. The corrupt doctor testified that Marcus's sudden appearance had triggered a severe schizophrenic break. The judge ruled that moving you would be detrimental to your fragile mental health. He granted Moesha permanent medical guardianship. Marcus was ordered to stay away to prevent further psychological damage. Tears of absolute fury spilled down my cheeks. My mother had poisoned my developing brain. She had stolen my father, stolen my memories, and convinced me I was broken. I realized then why Jamal had played along with Moesha's narrative of my mental fragility. I realized why he had called her tonight, claiming I was acting irrational. They were using my fabricated medical history as a weapon. "Where is he?" I demanded, wiping my face aggressively. "Where is Marcus now? I need to see him. I need to talk to my father." Desmond looked away, staring out the dark window at the passing city lights. The heavy silence in the carriage told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Marcus passed away 4 months ago, Nia," Desmond said softly. His heart simply gave out. He spent his entire life building an empire for you, and the stress of losing you broke him. I am so deeply sorry. I promised him I would find you and deliver his legacy. That is why I am here. A sharp physical pain pierced my chest. The father I never knew, the man who had fought for me, was gone. Moesha had won. She had kept us apart until the very end. But the tears of grief quickly evaporated, replaced by a burning, unquenchable rage. I was a wealth management consultant. I knew exactly what happened when a mogul passed away. I looked at Desmond, my professional instincts slicing through my emotional devastation. "You are an estate executor," I stated, my voice turning to ice. "You are not here just to give me a photograph and a tragic backstory. You are here because of assets. What did my father leave me?" Desmond nodded, a look of profound respect crossing his face. Marcus was brilliant. He knew Moshe would try to sink her claws into his money if he died. So he structured his assets with absolute precision. He liquidated his commercial properties and established a bulletproof ironclad trust fund. The sole beneficiary is you. "How much?" I asked flatly. $45 million, Desmond replied without a single flinch. $45 million in diversified high-yield accounts. It is entirely yours, completely untouchable by anyone else. 45 million. The number echoed in my mind. It was empire-changing money. It was generational wealth. It was enough money to buy and sell Jamal's pathetic startup 1,000 times over. It was enough money to destroy Moesha completely. "There is a condition," Desmond continued, leaning closer over the plastic table. "Marcus set the age of disbursement at 30. He wanted to ensure you were a fully mature adult out of Moesha's house and capable of managing the wealth before you received it. He structured it so the trust automatically executes on your 30th birthday. I stared at him doing the mental math instantly. My heart stopped. Desmond. I whispered, the final puzzle piece locking into place with terrifying clarity. I turned 30 in exactly 3 weeks. I know, Desmond said, his voice urgent and tight. And so does Moshe. She received a mandatory legal notification from probate court when Marcus passed away 4 months ago. She knows the trust exists, and she knows it unlocks in 21 days. The entire grand conspiracy unraveled before my eyes. The timing of Jamal's sudden financial demands, the rent, the aggressive attempt to force me to sign my condo over to his business. It was never about a failing startup. It was never about Brenda's rent money. It was about absolute control. Moisha is still listed as your former legal medical guardian in the state records, Desmond explained rapidly. If she can prove that you are currently suffering a severe mental relapse, if she can prove that your supposed schizophrenia has returned and you are a danger to yourself and your finances, she can petition the probate court to reinstate her active guardianship. She wants to seize the trust, I said, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. She wants to drain every single penny, Desmond confirmed. But she cannot do it alone. She needs corroborating testimony from someone living with you. She needs a spouse to testify that you are mentally unfit, erratic, and legally incapable of managing $45 million. Jamal, my charming, loving husband. Moesha had not just conspired with him, she had recruited him. She had likely promised him a massive cut of my inheritance if he helped her execute the final stage of her lifelong con. That was why Jamal gaslighted me. That was why he constantly called me irrational. That was why he had pushed me so hard at dinner, trying to trigger an emotional explosion he could document. They wanted me to look crazy. They wanted to lock me in a psychiatric hold right before my birthday. My own mother had drugged my childhood to keep a child support check. Now she was using my husband to drug my future to steal an empire. I sat back against the train window, the cold glass pressing against my spine. I was not a broken, mentally fragile woman. I was a 29-year-old financial shark. I protected billions of dollars from my clients. I knew how to restructure assets, how to bury money in shell corporations, and how to execute hostile takeovers. Moesha and Jamal thought I was a sheep they were leading to the slaughter. They had no idea they had just walked into the cage with a wolf. I looked at Desmond, the grief completely burning out of my system, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Desmond? I said, my voice steady and lethal. If Moesha tries to claim guardianship, this goes to probate court. If it goes to probate, it gets tied up in litigation for decades. We cannot let her file that petition. Agreed, Desmond stated. We need hard evidence of her current financial fraud to completely discredit her medical claims. We need to catch them in the act. We will do more than catch them, I replied, staring out into the dark night. We are going to let them think they won. We are going to feed their greed until they choke on it. I gripped the handles of my leather bag. The documents inside were my armor. My mind raced through the legal framework of limited liability companies, offshore trusts, and spousal asset transfers. Jamal thought he was a brilliant entrepreneur. Moesha thought she was a mastermind manipulator. I would use their absolute arrogance against them. I would construct a financial trap so complex, so perfectly disguised as submission, that they would gleefully sign their own death warrants. Desmond, I said, leaning over the table, my eyes locking onto his. I need you to prepare a series of extremely specific legal documents. I need power of attorney transfers, corporate liability waivers, and offshore banking declarations. Can you do that? Desmond smiled for the first time, a slow, predatory grin that mirrored my father's photograph. I can have them drafted by sunrise. Good, I whispered, because tomorrow morning I am going back to my husband. I am going to be the perfect broken submissive wife they so desperately want me to be. I looked down at the photograph of my father one last time, memorizing the shape of his smile, committing his stolen love to my heart. He had built this empire for me. I would not let them touch a single brick of it. I would burn Jamal's fake empire to the ground. I would tear up Moesha's entire life by the roots. I would take back my sanity, my memory, and my future. They want to steal $45 million from a dead man. I said, the rhythm of the train matching the pulse of my newly awakened ruthlessness. Let us see how they handle a living nightmare. Desmond reached across the scratched plastic table and placed a steady, reassuring hand over mine. The train was slowing down, the harsh morning light breaking over the industrial outskirts of the city, casting long shadows through the carriage windows. He opened his leather briefcase and carefully extracted a thick manila folder, sliding it toward my bag. He explained the brutal, unforgiving reality of probate court. Moesha held a massive, terrifying advantage. She had years of falsified medical records documenting my supposed severe mental instability. If she filed a petition claiming I was having a schizophrenic relapse right before my 30th birthday, the court would instantly freeze the $45 million trust fund. The funds would be locked in legal limbo for decades while lawyers argued over my sanity. My father's empire would be slowly drained by exorbitant legal fees, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I listened carefully, my mind operating with the cold, detached precision of a wealth management consultant assessing a hostile corporate takeover. I asked Desmond what we needed to do to bypass the fabricated medical records. Desmond leaned in, his deep voice, barely a whisper, over the screeching train brakes. He told me we needed incontrovertible proof of active ongoing financial fraud. If we could prove Moesha and Jamal were currently conspiring to steal my existing assets, it would instantly obliterate her credibility in probate court. A judge would throw out her guardianship petition immediately if we proved she was actively defrauding the ward she claimed to protect. But to get that concrete proof, Desmond warned, I had to walk straight back into the viper's nest. I had to give them exactly what they wanted. I had to play the role of the broken, mentally fragile woman they had spent years trying to permanently create. I had to let them think they had completely broken my spirit and shattered my confidence. If I fought them openly, they would panic, lawyer up, and hide their tracks. If I surrendered, their sheer arrogance would make them sloppy. They would leave a digital paper trail leading right to their offshore accounts. I agreed to the strategy. I took the secure burner phone Desmond handed me, memorized his private contact number, and walked off the train. The morning air was crisp, but my blood ran ice cold. I hailed a cab back to the luxury apartment I shared with Jamal. During the 20-minute ride through the waking city, I practiced my performance. I let my shoulders slump forward. I practiced making my hands tremble uncontrollably. I forced hot tears to the surface, remembering the absolute devastating betrayal of my mother, using that genuine, agonizing pain to fuel a fabricated mental breakdown. When I reached my front door, I took one last deep breath to steady my racing heart. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. Jamal was pacing the hardwood floor of the entryway, his phone glued to his ear. When he saw me, he ended the call abruptly. His face was a mask of furious indignation. He marched toward me, towering over my frame, ready to unleash a barrage of intimidation. He demanded to know where I had been all night, screaming that I had embarrassed him in front of his family. He told me I was acting crazy, throwing that specific word around like a weapon, testing to see if his psychological conditioning was still holding. This was the exact moment. I dropped my leather bag onto the floor. I let my knees buckle, slightly sagging against the doorframe. I buried my face in my hands and forced a loud, ragged sob from my chest. I cried, shaking violently, playing the role of a woman whose mind was rapidly unraveling. I looked up at him through a veil of tears and told him I was so incredibly sorry. I told him the intense pressure at the wealth management firm was destroying my mind. I claimed I had not slept in days, that my brain was playing cruel tricks on me, and that I had wandered the city all night because I was suffering from a massive panic attack. The transformation in Jamal was instant and sickening. The furious, shouting tyrant vanished, replaced by a condescending, manipulative savior. He loved this. He fed on my supposed weakness. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling my head against his chest. He shushed me, petting my hair with fake performative tenderness. He told me he knew I was not in my right mind. He told me he had spoken to Moesha, and they both agreed I was showing dangerous signs of a mental breakdown. He said I was working far too hard for ungrateful corporate bosses, and that I just needed to submit to his leadership so he could completely take care of me. I buried my face in his designer shirt to hide my absolute overwhelming disgust. I nodded against his chest, murmuring that he was absolutely right. I told him I needed him to lead our family. I told him I was losing my grip on reality and desperately needed my strong husband to anchor me. I could feel his chest swell with arrogant pride. He thought he had completely won. He thought Moesha's years of chemical gaslighting had permanently broken my brain, leaving him with a wealthy, compliant puppet. He kissed the top of my head and told me everything was going to be fine. He said his mother and sister had stayed over to help take care of me because they were so worried about my fragile mental state. He gently guided me into the living room. The sight that greeted me in my own living room required every ounce of willpower I possessed not to erupt in immediate violence. The apartment, which I had meticulously decorated and paid for entirely with my own salary, had been completely invaded. The air reeked of Brenda's cheap, heavy floral perfume, entirely masking the scent of the expensive imported candles I usually burned. Brenda was sitting in my favorite velvet armchair, her shoes propped up on my imported mahogany coffee table, sipping sweet tea from my crystal glassware. She looked at me with a triumphant, malicious gleam in her dark eyes. But it was Keisha who made my blood boil to a dangerous temperature. Keisha was lounging across my imported Italian leather sofa. She was eating buttery toast, letting the greasy crumbs fall freely onto the pristine cream-colored upholstery. And she was wearing my clothes. She had gone directly into my master closet and put on my custom-tailored silk robe, the one I had purchased during a trip to Paris. Beneath the delicate robe, she was wearing a vintage designer t-shirt that I had spent months sourcing. She did not even look slightly embarrassed when I walked into the room. She simply chewed her toast, looked me up and down, and smirked. "Well, look who finally decided to come home and act like a proper, respectful wife," Brenda announced, not bothering to remove her dirty shoes from my table. "Jamal told us you were having one of your little episodes. You need to prey on that troubled mind of yours, Nia. A good wife does not run off into the night just because her mother-in-law demands a little respect and a little rent money to help the family." I stood there staring at my expensive silk robe draped over Keisha's ungrateful shoulders. The urge to rip it off her back was overwhelming. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. I wanted to throw them both out onto the concrete street. But Desmond's warning echoed loudly in my mind. I needed them comfortable. I needed them incredibly greedy. I swallowed my pride, a bitter, jagged pill that scraped painfully against my throat. I forced my hands to relax their tight grip. I pasted a fragile, deeply submissive smile onto my face. "I am sorry, Brenda," I said, making my voice sound small and utterly defeated. "I was just so overwhelmed. My job is demanding, and I let the severe stress cloud my judgment. I know you and Keisha are just trying to support Jamal. You are family. I should not have reacted that way. I was entirely out of line." Keisha let out a loud, mocking laugh that grated on my nerves. She stood up, wrapping my silk robe tightly around her waist, and walked casually over to me. She wiped a butter-stained finger carelessly on the delicate silk fabric. "It is about time you realized your place in this house," Keisha sneered. "Jamal is the king of this family. You are just here to help fund the kingdom. By the way, I looked through your closet. You have a lot of stuff you do not even wear. I am taking a few bags of clothes and shoes with me to Miami. You owe me for stressing me out last night." I looked at the greasy butter stain forming on the imported silk. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from her smug face. "Yes," I replied softly, dropping my gaze to the floor in a show of total submission. "You can take whatever you need for your trip, Keisha. I just want to make things right with everyone." Brenda clapped her hands together, a sharp, approving sound that echoed in the living room. "Now that is the exact kind of submission the Lord rewards. Jamal, come get your wife a glass of water and tell her what needs to happen next. She looks like she is ready to listen." Jamal guided me to the sofa, gently pushing Keisha aside. He sat next to me, placing his hand heavily and possessively on my thigh. He looked at his mother and sister, exchanging a look of pure, victorious complicity. They had broken the high-earning corporate woman. They had brought the arrogant wealth manager to her knees. Jamal leaned close to my ear. "We need to talk about the business, Nia," he whispered, his tone attempting to sound loving, but utterly failing to hide his ravenous greed. "My investors are getting very anxious. We need to secure the capital today. I cannot have my wife hiding major assets from me while I am trying to build our future. It makes me look weak to my partners." I looked up at him, widening my eyes to feign complete trust and helpless dependency. "You are right, Jamal," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured devotion. "I was so wrong to hide the condo from you. I was just scared and stressed from work. But I see clearly now. You are the absolute head of this household. You need the capital to build your tech company, and it is my sacred duty to provide it. I am ready to combine our assets. I am ready to sign everything over to you today." Jamal's face erupted into a massive, uncontrollable smile. His eyes widened with absolute euphoria. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. He pulled me into a tight hug, laughing out loud. He looked over my shoulder at Brenda, shooting her a triumphant wink. He thought he had conquered me. He thought his psychological warfare had yielded a multi-million-dollar payday. His smug, victorious reaction would have made anyone's blood boil. But deep inside, beneath the fake tears and the submissive posture, the wolf in me was baring its teeth. He wanted to combine our assets. He wanted me to open the door to my financial kingdom. I was going to gladly hand him the keys right after I wired the entire castle with explosives. The rest of the day was an agonizing exercise in restraint. I played the role of the docile, broken wife to absolute perfection. I cooked dinner, allowing Keisha to critique my seasoning and Brenda to lecture me on proper domestic duties. Jamal paraded around our apartment like a conquering emperor, pouring himself expensive scotch and talking loudly about the massive valuation his tech startup was about to achieve. I nodded at all the right times, keeping my eyes wide and compliant, masking the lethal calculations running continuously in my mind. By midnight, the performance had exhausted them. Keisha and Brenda retreated to the guest bedroom, loudly claiming the most comfortable blankets. Jamal stumbled into our master bedroom, heavy with liquor and the intoxicating high of his perceived victory. He fell asleep almost instantly, his heavy snores vibrating through the dark room. I lay perfectly still next to him for a full hour, regulating my breathing, ensuring he was entirely submerged in a deep alcohol-induced slumber. When the digital clock on the nightstand shifted to 2 in the morning, I moved. I slipped out from under the heavy duvet with the silent precision of a ghost. I did not turn on any lights. I navigated the dark bedroom by memory, my bare feet making zero sound against the hardwood floor. I located Jamal's sleek silver laptop resting on his leather armchair. He guarded this machine with his life, rarely letting it out of his sight. He believed he was a master of cybersecurity, often bragging about his encrypted hard drives and complex firewalls. But Jamal was a small-time hustler playing in a league he did not understand. I was a senior wealth management consultant. My daily routine involved securing billions of dollars in assets against international cyber syndicates. Overcoming Jamal's laptop security was not going to be a challenge. It was going to be an autopsy. I carried the laptop into my master bathroom, the only room in the apartment with a solid lock and heavy soundproofing. I locked the door and sat on the cold tile floor, resting the machine on my lap. I pulled a specialized USB drive from my leather go bag. It was a military-grade decryption key provided to me by my firm for conducting deep financial forensics on high-risk client portfolios. I slid the drive into the port and booted up the machine. Jamal's password prompt appeared on the screen. I did not even try to guess it. I simply ran the override protocol from the USB drive. Lines of code cascaded down the black screen as the decryption software sliced through his basic firewall like a scalpel through tissue paper. In less than 45 seconds, the desktop loaded. I was in. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I completely ignored his browser history and his social media accounts. I did not care about the superficial details of his life. I was hunting for the financial architecture of his fake tech empire. I bypassed his main user folders and dug straight into the encrypted hidden drives where he kept his corporate accounting software. The software required a secondary biometric bypass, which my toolkit shattered in another 60 seconds. The internal ledgers of his startup bloomed across the glowing screen. I began scrolling through his capital tables and expense reports. To the untrained eye, it looked like a legitimate struggling tech venture. There were payroll accounts, server hosting fees, and marketing budgets. But I was not an untrained eye. I saw the glaring irregularities immediately. The user acquisition costs were completely fabricated. The payroll accounts were funneling money into dead-end subsidiary companies. But the most glaring anomaly was his seed funding. Jamal claimed he had secured angel investment from a silent partner in Atlanta. He claimed this investor believed in his vision and had provided the initial $2 million to launch the company. I located the origin of the seed money transfers. I stared at the routing numbers, my eyes narrowing. The funds did not originate from Atlanta. They originated from a labyrinth of offshore banking institutions. I cracked my knuckles and leaned closer to the screen. It was time to follow the money. I tracked the first major wire transfer of $500,000. It came from a holding account in the British Virgin Islands. From there, I traced the routing history backward, watching the money bounce through a complex web of shell companies. It moved from the British Virgin Islands to a corporate trust in Panama, then to an anonymous holding company in the Seychelles, before finally landing in a primary account managed by a wealth consolidation firm in the Cayman Islands. It was a sophisticated money laundering technique called layering, designed specifically to obscure the original source of the funds. Whoever set this up had paid top dollar for premium financial camouflage. But every digital transaction leaves a footprint, and I possessed the exact tools required to illuminate them. I ran a deep trace on the Cayman Island firm, cross-referencing their corporate registry against international banking databases. The security protocols on the Cayman account were formidable, but the routing numbers revealed the ultimate beneficiary of the offshore trust. I initiated a direct query on the beneficiary identification code. A progress bar crawled across the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The percentage climbed slowly. 50%, 70%, 90%. The screen flashed green. The data decrypted. The name of the ultimate beneficiary materialized in sharp white letters against the dark background. Moesha. I stopped breathing. I stared at my mother's name on the screen, the glowing letters burning into my vision. Moesha was the silent angel investor. Moesha was the one funneling millions of dollars into Jamal's fake tech startup through a network of Caribbean shell companies. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me for a moment. Moesha had always played the role of the struggling working-class mother. She complained endlessly about church dues and grocery prices, yet she was sitting on millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts. I realized immediately where that money came from. It was the child support. My father, Marcus, had funneled a fortune to her over the years, trying to ensure I was taken care of. She had hoarded every single penny, laundering it offshore, forcing me to grow up in poverty while she built a hidden empire of stolen wealth. But why was she giving it to Jamal? Why was she funding a fake tech company for a man she supposedly despised when we first met? I needed the rest of the puzzle. I closed the accounting software and opened Jamal's encrypted email server. I ran a global search for any hidden communications between Jamal and Moesha, filtering by the dates preceding our initial meeting. I found a locked archive folder buried deep within his deleted items. I shattered the folder's encryption and opened the oldest email in the chain. The message was dated 3 years ago. It was sent 6 full months before Jamal and I supposedly had our romantic accidental meet cute at a downtown coffee shop. The sender was Moesha. The recipient was Jamal. I opened the email. The subject line was simply labeled Project Nia. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I read the words on the screen, my entire reality disintegrating with every sentence. It was not a casual message. It was a formal, heavily detailed contract. Moesha was offering Jamal a job. The job was to marry me. The contract outlined the terms with sickening clinical precision. Jamal was to orchestrate a meeting, gain my trust, and secure a marriage proposal. In exchange, Moesha would provide the seed funding for his fake tech startup, laundering the money through the Cayman accounts to ensure I never traced it back to her. She detailed a comprehensive bonus structure. He would receive a payout when we moved in together, another payout on our wedding day, and monthly stipends disguised as investor dividends. But the most devastating part of the contract was the operational directive. Moisha explicitly instructed Jamal on how to handle my psychology. She provided him with a detailed manual on how to manipulate me. Keep her isolated, the email read. Encourage her to cut ties with her wealthy colleagues. Make her feel guilty for working long hours. When she gets stressed, remind her of her mental fragility. Use the medical history I provided you. Gaslight her at every opportunity. Make her doubt her own sanity. Make her completely dependent on your leadership. A wave of profound physical nausea washed over me. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a cry of absolute agony. Every fight we ever had, every time he told me I was overreacting, every time he made me feel crazy for questioning his business expenses, every time he convinced me my memory was failing, it was all scripted, it was all a paid performance. Jamal did not love me. He had never loved me. Our entire relationship was a corporate transaction, a high-stakes con orchestrated by my own mother. I opened the next email in the chain, reading through my tears. The correspondence detailed the final phase of their monstrous plan. Moesha explicitly outlined the timeline. She explained that a massive trust fund belonging to me would unlock on my 30th birthday. The objective was clear. Jamal was to break my spirit entirely by the time I turned 30. He was to ensure I was docile, medicated, and legally classified as incompetent. Once the trust unlocked, they would use my fake mental breakdown as leverage. Jamal, acting as my supportive husband, and Moesha, acting as my former medical guardian, would jointly force me to sign over the $45 million to his tech holding company. Once the transfer was complete, they would split the $45 million. And I would be committed to a psychiatric facility, permanently silenced, trapped in the chemical prison Moesha had designed for me when I was 15 years old. I stared at the screen, the glow of the laptop illuminating the tears sliding down my face. The absolute staggering depth of the betrayal broke something fundamental inside my soul. My mother had sold my life to a parasite. My husband had auctioned off my sanity for a seed round of funding. They had treated my existence like a hostile corporate takeover. They had smiled in my face, slept in my bed, and eaten at my table while meticulously planning to steal my father's legacy and lock me in a padded cell. The grief completely evaporated, burned away by a searing nuclear rage. I closed the laptop and pulled the USB drive from the port. I sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, the darkness wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I was no longer the confused, desperate woman who had run onto that midnight train. I was no longer the broken wife crying in the entryway. I was a predator forged in the fires of absolute betrayal. Moesha and Jamal wanted to play a high-stakes financial game. They wanted to use offshore accounts and corporate contracts to steal my life. I wiped the tears from my face, my eyes turning cold and dead. I was going to show them what a real wealth manager could do. I was going to dismantle their entire fraudulent empire, drain their hidden accounts, and leave them with absolutely nothing. I was going to take everything they valued and crush it to dust. The fake surrender was over. The annihilation was about to begin. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting sharp geometric shadows across the hardwood floor of the master bedroom. I stood in the ensuite bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I splashed cold water on my face, carefully reapplying a thin layer of makeup to emphasize the dark circles under my eyes. I needed to look fragile. I needed to look like a woman whose sanity was actively crumbling under the weight of her husband's brilliance. I packed the military-grade decryption drive deep into the hidden lining of my makeup bag. I took a slow, measured breath, locking away the wealth management shark and pulling the mask of the broken, submissive wife firmly back into place. When I walked into the living room, the air was thick with the scent of cheap vanilla perfume and greasy food. Keisha was sprawled across my imported Italian leather sofa, her bare feet resting on the pristine cushions. She was scrolling through her phone, still wearing my custom-tailored Parisian silk robe. Brenda sat in my velvet armchair, humming along to a televangelist broadcasting loudly on the flat-screen television. Jamal was nowhere to be seen, likely still sleeping off the alcohol and the intoxicating high of his perceived victory. Keisha did not bother to look up from her screen when I entered. "I need a car," she announced, her voice dripping with sheer, unadulterated entitlement. "I am moving to Miami in 3 weeks, and I absolutely refuse to drive down there in my busted Honda Civic. Jamal told us his tech company is about to close a massive funding round today. Since you are finally acting right and combining all your assets with his business, you are going to co-sign a lease for me. I want a Range Rover. White exterior, red leather interior, and the upgraded sound system. And you better make sure the insurance covers premium roadside assistance. I am not changing a tire in the Miami heat." Brenda turned away from the television, fixing me with a stern, judgmental glare. "It is the least you can do, Nia," she stated, crossing her arms over her chest. "Family takes care of family. Jamal has carried the emotional and financial burden of dealing with your mental episodes for long enough. You owe this family. You need to show some respect to his bloodline." I forced my shoulders to slump. I lowered my gaze to the floor, channeling every ounce of corporate negotiation training I possessed to keep my expression perfectly submissive. "You are completely right, Brenda," I whispered, making my voice tremble slightly. "I have been so selfish and difficult. A Range Rover would be wonderful for Keisha. In fact, I can do something even better than a standard cosign. Because my credit score is in the top 1%, I can secure a corporate commercial lease through Jamal's tech holding company. It will drastically lower the interest rate and provide a massive tax write-off for Jamal's business. It is the smart financial move." Keisha sat up, her eyes widening with immediate greed. "A corporate lease. So the company covers the insurance and the maintenance fees too." "Exactly," I replied, offering a weak, eager-to-please smile. "Let me just go into the home office and draft the dealership paperwork. It will only take me an hour to get the commercial guarantor profiles ready." I walked into the spare bedroom, shut the door, and locked it silently. I opened my secure laptop and connected to my encrypted server. I was not drafting a vehicle lease. I was drafting a financial execution. I pulled up the corporate structure of Jamal's fake tech startup. The company was a fragile, chaotic web of limited liability companies designed solely to funnel Moesha's laundered child support money. Because Jamal was a terrible businessman, playing a game he did not understand, the primary holding company carried a massive, undocumented mountain of federal tax liabilities. He had been ignoring IRS filings for years, illegally writing off personal expenses and accumulating corporate debt under the arrogant assumption that he would soon use my $45 million trust fund to wipe his slate clean. I generated a thick stack of complex corporate restructuring documents. I utilized the densest, most impenetrable legal jargon available in my wealth management arsenal. I created a transfer of liability addendum. Buried deep on page 47, camouflaged beneath paragraphs of standard commercial vehicle tax code and operational indemnity clauses, was a single lethal paragraph. It explicitly and irrevocably named Brenda and Keisha as the primary legal guarantors of Jamal's central holding company. By signing this specific document, they were not co-signing a car lease. They were legally assuming full, unconditional personal responsibility for every single cent of Jamal's corporate debt, including his massive federal tax evasion penalties. I added a strict joint and several liability clause. I added a cross-collateralization agreement. The IRS does not negotiate with fraudulent shell company guarantors. They garnish wages. They seize assets. They drain bank accounts without warning. Brenda and Keisha were currently unemployed, relying entirely on Jamal's handouts and Brenda's Social Security. By signing this document, they were volunteering to be the primary targets of a federal tax investigation. They would be financially chained to a sinking ship with zero legal recourse. I hit print. The laser printer hummed to life, methodically churning out 60 pages of absolute financial ruin. I gathered the thick stack of papers, aligned the edges perfectly, and attached a pristine blue pen to the clipboard. I walked back out to the living room. Keisha was already browsing luxury car dealership websites, loudly debating the merits of tinted windows. Brenda was sipping her coffee, looking incredibly pleased with herself. I placed the massive stack of documents on the mahogany coffee table right in front of them. "Here is the commercial guarantor profile," I said, gently keeping my posture deferential. Because it is a corporate vehicle acquisition tied directly to Jamal's tech firm, the dealership requires a full commercial liability waiver. It basically just means you are authorized representatives of his business taking possession of the company car. Keisha scoffed, eyeing the intimidating mountain of paper. "I am not reading all of this legal garbage," she snapped, grabbing the clipboard. "Just show me where to sign so I can go call the dealership." Brenda leaned forward, placing a heavy hand on top of the documents. She looked at me with a smug, deeply condescending expression. "This is exactly what the Lord requires of a wife," Nia Brenda preached, her voice thick with manufactured piety and arrogant authority. Ephesians 5:22. "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord." You are finally learning your proper place. A woman's highest calling is to serve her husband's vision and bless his family. By surrendering your finances and your pride today, you are purifying your troubled soul. She was using my faith as a weapon to mask a blatant shakedown. She was quoting scripture to justify stealing from a woman she believed was mentally ill. I nodded slowly, maintaining unbroken subservient eye contact. "I am learning so much from your guidance, Brenda," I replied smoothly. "If you could just sign right there on the bottom line, and Keisha, I need your signature next to the corporate guarantor seal." Keisha snatched the pen. She flipped directly to the last page, completely ignoring the 60 pages of lethal financial restructuring preceding it. She scribbled her signature with dramatic, eager flair. She handed the blue pen to Brenda. Brenda did not even glance at the header of the document. She took the pen and signed her name with aggressive, sweeping strokes, permanently and legally binding herself to Jamal's fraudulent shell companies. I pulled the clipboard back against my chest, ensuring the ink was dry. "You have no idea how much this means to me," I said, smiling at them both. "I will go file these with the corporate office right away. You girls enjoy the rest of your morning." I walked back toward the home office, my spine straightening with every step. The trap was set. The parasites had just eagerly swallowed the poison. I secured the freshly signed commercial guarantor documents in my briefcase, locking the home office door behind me. I walked back out to the living room, projecting an aura of quiet, exhausted compliance. I told Jamal I was heading to my wealth management firm to process the initial asset combination paperwork. He kissed my cheek, his eyes practically gleaming with dollar signs, and shoved me out the door with eager encouragement. Instead of heading to my corporate office, I drove my car to a subterranean parking garage 3 miles across the city. I bypassed my usual parking spot, navigating to the deepest, darkest level of the concrete structure. I left the keys in the ignition and slipped into the back of a heavily tinted black town car idling in the shadows. Desmond sat in the back seat, his expression carved from stone. He tapped the glass partition, and the driver immediately pulled out into the morning traffic, executing a series of aggressive, evasive turns to ensure we were not being followed. We rode in silence until we reached a nondescript, brutalist concrete building on the industrial edge of the financial district. Desmond guided me through a restricted service entrance, completely bypassing the main lobby and the security cameras. We took a rattling freight elevator to a windowless, soundproofed conference room on the 14th floor. Waiting for us were two individuals who radiated cold, lethal authority. Special Agent Reynolds from the FBI wore a sharp navy suit and possessed a gaze that felt like a physical interrogation. Investigator Hayes from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division sat next to him, rhythmically tapping a silver pen against a blank legal pad. I did not waste time with pleasantries or introductions. I unzipped my leather go-bag and placed the encrypted military-grade drive directly in the center of the steel table. I slid the freshly signed commercial guarantor documents next to it. I stood at the head of the table and laid out the entire financial anatomy of Jamal's fake tech startup. I walked the federal agents through the labyrinth of Cayman Island shell companies, tracing the wire transfers step by step. I displayed the exact routing numbers linking the supposedly clean seed money directly to Moesha's offshore accounts. I watched investigator Hayes stop tapping his pen as I mapped out the sheer volume of federal tax liabilities and fraudulent write-offs Jamal had illegally accrued. I laid bare the entire corporate money laundering machine they had built using my stolen child support funds. The trap was perfectly constructed, and I was handing the detonation cord directly to the federal government. Agent Reynolds leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together on the metal table. He admitted that my forensic accounting was impeccable. The data I had pulled from Jamal's hidden drives proved a massive, highly coordinated conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and international money laundering. However, building a federal indictment that would hold up in court against highly paid defense attorneys required more than digital breadcrumbs. Lawyers could easily argue that Jamal's computer was hacked, or that Moesha's name was fraudulently attached to the offshore accounts by an unknown third party. Digital trails could be disputed. To secure immediate, devastating federal indictments, they needed absolute, undeniable proof of intent. To lock this down, Reynolds explained, his voice devoid of any emotion. We need a smoking gun. We need a physical or digitally authenticated document explicitly signed by both Jamal and Moesha, together admitting active ownership and management of those specific offshore accounts. They have to acknowledge the movement of the funds in writing. Without that explicit admission, Moesha will use her stolen wealth to hire a fleet of attorneys who will tie this up in jurisdictional battles for the next decade. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic, suffocating rhythm. I reminded the agents about the terrifying ticking clock hanging over my head. In exactly 21 days, I turned 30. On that specific day, a $45 million trust fund from my deceased father would automatically execute into my name. Moesha had already fabricated a robust medical history, painting me as a violent, early-onset schizophrenic. She and Jamal were simply waiting for the exact moment to strike. They planned to trigger a fake mental collapse, legally seize the trust, and lock me in a psychiatric facility before the funds could ever reach my personal accounts. If we did not secure this final piece of evidence before my birthday, the federal investigation would not matter. I would be silenced, heavily medicated, and permanently stripped of my father's legacy. Investigator Hayes looked me dead in the eye. He told me I had to draft a document that looked exactly like a standard corporate asset merger. I had to bury the specific offshore account numbers inside it, explicitly linking Jamal's domestic company to Moesha's Caribbean trusts. And I had to get them both to sign it willingly. It was a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. If either of them actually read the document carefully, they would instantly realize they were confessing to federal crimes. The entire operation would collapse, and they would execute their medical guardianship plan immediately to neutralize me. I nodded slowly, feeling the cold, crushing weight of the task settling over my shoulders. I told the agents I would get the signatures. I returned to the apartment late that evening, a secure burner phone tucked tightly against my hip inside my jacket pocket. The air in the apartment was thick with heavy cigar smoke, and the loud, obnoxious sounds of Jamal playing video games on the massive flat-screen television. Brenda and Keisha were out spending Jamal's credit cards, completely oblivious to the federal tax nightmare they had eagerly signed up for that morning. I walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of ice water to soothe my parched throat. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, already drafting the complex legal framework for the final confession document. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket, needing to send a quick, highly encrypted message to Desmond, confirming our strategy and requesting specific legal verbiage. I tapped out the message rapidly, my focus entirely consumed by the glowing screen. I did not hear Jamal walk up behind me. He moved with a sudden, silent speed that completely betrayed his usual clumsy arrogance. "What is that?" Jamal's voice boomed right next to my ear. I flinched, my pulse skyrocketing instantly. I gripped the burner phone tightly, my thumb hovering desperately over the screen lock button. Jamal grabbed my wrist, his large fingers digging painfully into my skin. He yanked my hand around his eyes, narrowing to dangerous slits as he stared at the unfamiliar device. His paranoia flared instantly. He demanded to know why I had a second phone. He accused me of talking to wealth management partners behind his back, of trying to hide my assets before the merger. His voice grew loud and threatening, his chest puffing out in an aggressive display of dominance. He reached out with his free hand to snatch the device from my grip. My survival instincts kicked into massive overdrive. I could not let him see the encrypted messaging app. If he saw Desmond's name, the entire operation was dead. I forced my muscles to completely relax. I let out a soft, exasperated sigh, dropping all the tension in my body. I looked up at him, making my eyes wide, soft, and entirely innocent. "Jamal, you are ruining the surprise," I whined, injecting my voice with a perfect blend of submissive disappointment and adoring wifely devotion. He paused, his hand hovering mere inches from the phone. "What surprise?" he demanded, his intense suspicion battling directly with his inherent narcissism. I stepped closer to him, softening my posture, until I was practically leaning against his chest. I told him that since we were combining our assets and building our empire, I wanted to buy him something truly extraordinary to celebrate his upcoming company anniversary gala. I explained that I was communicating with a private, highly exclusive jeweler in Switzerland. I claimed they required a secure encrypted line to handle the transaction because I was ordering a custom diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe watch. I told him I wanted him to look like the absolute king of the tech industry when he walked into that gala room. I bought the burner phone so the massive international charges and messages would not show up on our shared network and ruin the reveal before the big night. I held my breath, watching his face intently. I was playing directly to his massive, incredibly fragile ego. Jamal was a man obsessed with hollow status symbols. A custom Patek Philippe was his ultimate fantasy. The sheer greed washed over his features, instantly drowning out his paranoia. His grip on my wrist loosened entirely. A slow, deeply arrogant smile spread across his face. He let go of my arm and smoothed the lapels of his shirt. He told me I was finally acting like a proper, supportive wife. He praised me for recognizing his importance and investing in his image. He did not ask to see the phone again. He simply kissed my forehead, thoroughly blinded by the illusion of his own grandeur. He turned around and walked back into the living room, picking up his game controller and bragging loudly to his online friends about the custom watch he was going to wear to the gala. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the marble counter to stay upright. I had narrowly avoided complete disaster. The clock was ticking louder than ever. I had less than 3 weeks to forge the ultimate legal snare, secure the signatures of 2 master manipulators, and deliver their heads to the federal government before they could steal my mind and my father's empire. I slipped the burner phone back into my pocket. The real hunt was just beginning. The very next morning, I walked into the sunlit kitchen where Jamal was aggressively typing on his phone and drinking a double espresso. I had to deliver the bait flawlessly, wrapping my lethal intentions in a package of absolute devotion. I poured myself a glass of water, letting my hands tremble just slightly before placing the glass on the marble island. I told him I had spent the entire night lying awake thinking deeply about our future and his incredible vision for his tech empire. I kept my voice soft, breathless, and entirely submissive. I told him I had made the final decision. I had called my primary broker the moment the markets opened. The luxury downtown condo was officially in escrow with a highly motivated cash buyer already secured. Furthermore, I had issued the immediate liquidation orders for my entire portfolio of high-yield corporate bonds and blue-chip index funds. The capital was currently sitting in a secure, liquid holding account completely untethered and ready to be fully deployed into his central business account. Jamal froze. He slowly lowered his espresso cup to the counter, the ceramic clinking sharply against the stone. His eyes widened, a ravenous, predatory spark igniting in his dark pupils. The sheer magnitude of the wealth I was dangling in front of him temporarily short-circuited his brain. He asked me, his voice thick with poorly concealed greed, how much liquid capital we were talking about. I gave him a number that made him physically grip the edge of the kitchen island. But before he could demand the immediate wire transfer routing numbers, I executed the psychological pivot. I looked up at him through my eyelashes, playing the role of the proud, adoring wife who wanted to elevate her husband's public status. I told him I did not want to execute the transfer quietly in a sterile bank lobby. I told him I wanted to make a massive, undeniable statement. His company anniversary gala was happening in exactly 2 days. The venue would be packed with his startup employees, local venture capitalists, and high society networkers. I suggested we use the gala as the ultimate stage. I told him I had instructed my corporate attorneys to draft a comprehensive, legally binding asset integration master document. We would sign it together along with his primary silent investor, Moesha, in the private VIP suite at the gala. I framed it as a profound display of family unity and absolute financial invincibility. It would show every single person in that room that his tech company was backed by massive generational wealth, cementing his status as a titan of the industry. Jamal practically vibrated with euphoric arrogance. He loved the optics. He fed on the idea of a public theatrical display of his dominance. The concept of me handing over my financial sovereignty while he wore a custom tuxedo was an intoxicating fantasy he could not resist. He stepped forward and pulled me into a crushing embrace, kissing the top of my head and praising my newfound clarity. He agreed to the plan immediately, his monumental ego completely blinding him to the fatal reality of the situation. He had no idea that the master integration document my attorneys were supposedly drafting did not exist. He had no idea that the paperwork I was personally designing was the ultimate Trojan horse. It was a federal confession, meticulously formatted to look like a standard wealth transfer, explicitly linking Jamal's domestic shell companies to Moesha's offshore Cayman Island trusts. He was eager to sign the very instrument of his own destruction. The afternoon before the gala, the devil herself arrived at my front door. Moesha let herself into the apartment using the spare key Jamal had given her. The heavy, expensive scent of her designer perfume, entirely funded by my stolen child support payments, filled the entryway. She had come under the guise of maternal support, claiming she wanted to help me prepare for my husband's big night. I stood in the center of my master bedroom as Moesha glided in her eyes, scanning the room with a critical, deeply condescending gaze. She walked directly to my expansive walk-in closet and began pushing hangers aside with manicured fingers. She pulled out a drab, muted gray evening gown with a high neckline and an incredibly conservative cut. She held it up against my frame, nodding with sickening approval. She told me it was the perfect choice because a good wife should never attempt to outshine her husband, especially on a night dedicated to his corporate brilliance. She placed the gray fabric on the bed and turned to face me. Her expression shifted into a mask of pure, manufactured maternal warmth. She reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my recent behavior. She used a soft, soothing tone to explain that the intense stress of the corporate wealth management world had clearly been fracturing my fragile mind. She said she had been so terribly worried about my sanity, but seeing me finally submit to Jamal's leadership proved I was on the path to healing. She framed my financial surrender as a necessary medical intervention, a way to cure the aggressive schizophrenia she had spent years paying fraudulent doctors to document. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, pulling me into a deep, sustained hug. I felt her expensive silk blouse against my cheek. I felt her hands pressing into my back. This was the woman who had poisoned my food with powerful antipsychotics. This was the woman who had forged medical evaluations to paint me as a violent lunatic. This was the woman who had sold my future to a con artist in exchange for a percentage of my $45 million trust fund. Every single biological instinct in my body screamed at me to violently shove her away, to shatter her jaw, to scream the truth directly into her lying face. The sheer radioactive hatred burning in my chest was almost suffocating. But I am a professional. I operate with absolute lethal discipline. I closed my eyes and wrapped my arms around her waist, returning the embrace with equal pressure. I rested my chin on her shoulder and whispered that I was so incredibly grateful for her guidance. I thanked her for saving me from my own broken mind. My exterior was a perfect sculpture of submissive, defeated ice. My interior was a highly coordinated military strike. While she patted my back, congratulating herself on breaking me, I was mentally sealing her federal indictment. I was measuring her for her prison uniform. I was calculating the exact moment the FBI would kick down her front door. When she finally pulled away, satisfied with my performance, she told me she would see me in the VIP suite at the gala tomorrow night. I smiled and told her I would not miss it for the world. The evening of the gala arrived with the heavy electric tension of a gathering storm. Jamal left the apartment 4 hours early to oversee the venue preparations at a luxury downtown hotel. He instructed me to take a hired black car and meet him at the private entrance exactly at 8 o'clock. He wanted me to arrive quietly, slip into the VIP room, and wait for him to summon me for the signing ceremony. Once the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, the silence of the empty apartment became my sanctuary. The performance was over. The fake tears, the slumped shoulders, the trembling hands, I stripped all of it away in a matter of seconds. I walked into my master bathroom and stared at the mirror. I did not see the fragile, medicated victim they had tried to create. I saw an apex predator who had successfully navigated the viper's nest. I walked into my massive closet and shoved the drab, muted gray dress Moesha had selected off the bed and onto the floor. I kicked it under the nightstand. I walked to the very back of the closet, reaching behind my heavy winter coats, and unzipped a thick garment bag I had hidden there 3 weeks ago. I pulled out a custom-tailored, immaculate all-white power suit. The cut was razor-sharp, featuring structured shoulders and an aggressively tapered waist. The fabric was heavy, luxurious Italian wool that draped perfectly. It did not speak of submission or quiet domesticity. It screamed absolute, unapologetic authority. It was the armor of a woman who commanded rooms and liquidated empires before breakfast. I stripped off the oversized, shapeless sweatpants I had been wearing all day to maintain my depressed persona. I stepped into the tailored white trousers, the crisp fabric instantly changing my posture. I slipped on a seamless silk camisole and slid my arms into the structured blazer. I buttoned the jacket, feeling the familiar, empowering restriction of bespoke tailoring. I sat at my vanity and went to work on my face. For weeks, I had deliberately worn minimal makeup, allowing my skin to look pale and my eyes to look sunken and exhausted. Now I applied a flawless, high-coverage foundation. I aggressively contoured my cheekbones, giving my face a sharp, predatory angle. I pulled my hair back into a severe, ultra-sleek knot at the absolute base of my neck, ensuring not a single strand was out of place. Finally, I applied a striking, bold crimson lipstick. The vivid red slashed across the bottom half of my face, a stark, violent contrast to the pristine white of the suit. I stood back and faced the full-length mirror. The transformation was total and absolute. The white suit was not just a fashion choice. It was deliberate psychological symbolism. It was a complete rebirth. It was the color of a blank slate, the color of blinding, searing light, ready to entirely eradicate the dark, deceitful shadows Jamal and Moesha had operated in for years. I looked like an executioner arriving to collect a debt. I walked over to the hidden floor safe bolted beneath my desk in the home office. I entered the combination and extracted the final legal document. It was printed on thick premium bond paper, looking completely authentic and official. The front page featured the bold headers of an asset integration transfer. The buried clauses on page 4 explicitly confessed to the management and ownership of the Cayman Island shell accounts used for federal money laundering. I folded the heavy document precisely in half. I slid it into my sleek, geometric white leather clutch. I placed a heavy, solid silver fountain pen right next to it, the exact pen Jamal and Moesha would use to willingly sign away their freedom. I checked my reflection one last time, my pulse beating with a cold, rhythmic certainty. I picked up my clutch and walked out of the master bedroom, the sharp clack of my designer heels echoing like gunshots against the hardwood floor. I walked out of the apartment, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The satisfying click of the deadbolt resonated in the quiet hallway. I stepped into the elevator, descending into the belly of the city. I was no longer the prey. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was ready to burn their fraudulent kingdom to the absolute ground. I stepped out of the hired black town car and into the humid night air. The luxury downtown hotel loomed above me, a towering monolith of glass and steel. I completely bypassed the flashing cameras of the red carpet photo op Jamal had rented for the evening, slipping quietly through a side entrance for event staff. I navigated the carpeted corridors with silent, predatory focus until I reached the grand double doors of the primary banquet hall. I pushed them open just enough to step inside, immediately fading into the shadows near the back bar to survey the killing floor. The room was a gaudy, over-the-top monument to Jamal's desperate need for public validation. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a heavy, glittering light over dozens of tables draped in gold silk. Ice sculptures shaped like dollar signs and tech logos slowly melted near the buffet stations. The banquet hall was packed to absolute capacity with a sickening, chaotic mix of archetypes. In the far corner, a large group of Jamal's Kappa fraternity brothers were holding court, barking out their call signs, laughing loudly, and taking aggressive shots of premium liquor. The center of the room was crowded with fake angel investors and local hustlers dressed in cheap, shiny suits, vigorously shaking hands and pretending to understand venture capital valuations. But dominating the premium tables directly adjacent to the main stage were the high society church members Brenda had invited. They sat fanning themselves, sipping expensive champagne and whispering sharp judgments over catered plates of roasted salmon. I ordered a sparkling water from the bartender, keeping my back to the wall, as I watched the parasites gorge themselves on my stolen resources. Brenda was practically holding court at the center table. She was blinding the women sitting next to her with a massive, brilliantly cut diamond tennis necklace that rested heavily against her chest. I recognized the piece immediately. It was a custom order from a high-end jeweler in the financial district. She had purchased it using a supplementary corporate credit card tied directly to my personal checking account. She was laughing loudly, touching the diamonds with manicured fingers, and introducing herself to passing waiters as the mother of the city's next billionaire. A few feet away, Keisha was leaning aggressively against a high-top cocktail table, completely ignoring the event's formal dress code in favor of a skin-tight sequined dress. She was loudly jingling a heavy set of keys, thrusting the silver Range Rover emblem into the face of any man who made eye contact with her. I watched her brag to a group of fake investors about her upcoming move to Miami, claiming her brother had just bought her a luxury SUV outright. She looked completely triumphant. She was so blinded by her own manufactured entitlement that she had absolutely no idea that the silver keychain she was waving around was a legal anchor. She had no idea she had willingly signed away her financial freedom and tied herself to a massive federal tax evasion nightmare. I shifted my gaze across the crowded room. Moesha was sitting in a velvet-lined VIP booth elevated above the main floor. She was holding a crystal flute of imported champagne, looking over the crowd with a smug, deeply satisfied smirk. She played the role of the proud, silent investor flawlessly. When our eyes met across the vast expanse of the banquet hall, she raised her glass to me in a silent toast. She thought she had completely won. She thought the culmination of her 3-year psychological torture campaign was about to pay off with a massive $45 million payday. I stared back at her, keeping my expression entirely blank, my exterior absolute ice. I did not break eye contact until she finally looked away, a slight, uneasy frown touching her lips. Suddenly, the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed to a dramatic low glow. A blinding white spotlight hit the center of the main stage. A heavy, aggressive hip-hop beat blasted through the massive surround sound speakers. The crowd erupted into cheers and whistles as Jamal jogged onto the stage, bouncing on his toes like a heavyweight prizefighter entering an arena. He was wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue tuxedo with a black silk lapel. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, flashing a bright, perfectly veneered smile at the audience. His fraternity brothers barked loudly from the back of the room, and Jamal raised his hands, soaking in the manufactured adoration. He launched into a deeply narcissistic, insufferable monologue. He paced across the stage, gripping the microphone tightly, and began bragging about his relentless grind and his unmatched business brilliance. He claimed his tech startup was about to completely revolutionize the global digital market, effortlessly throwing around meaningless corporate buzzwords like blockchain integration, algorithmic synergy, and disruptive paradigm shifts. He spoke for a solid 10 minutes, without actually delivering a single coherent sentence about what his company supposedly produced. The fake investors nodded along with profound seriousness, completely mesmerized by the illusion of his wealth. Then Jamal slowed his pacing. The heavy beat faded out. He walked to the edge of the stage, lowering his voice into a serious preacher-like cadence that echoed his mother's manipulative tone. "A man can build a massive empire," Jamal announced, pointing a finger out into the crowd. "But a king cannot sustain his kingdom without a compliant queen." The room grew quiet, hanging on his every word. He began to preach about the modern world corrupting women, making them too independent, too stubborn, and too focused on their own careers. He looked directly down at Brenda's table, earning loud vocal murmurs of agreement and polite applause from the high society church ladies. "A truly successful black man needs a woman who knows how to fall in line," Jamal declared, his voice echoing through the silent banquet hall. "I see a lot of brothers out here struggling because their women want to compete with them instead of supporting them. I had to teach my wife that lesson. I took a corporate workaholic, a woman who thought her stressful career was everything, and I showed her the supreme value of absolute submission. Her greatest achievement is not her bank account or her resume. Her greatest achievement is her willingness to surrender her assets to my superior vision. We are building a legacy, and she finally understands that her only job is to fund the kingdom and let me wear the crown." A wave of thunderous applause rippled through the room. The sheer toxic misogyny of his speech was being celebrated as a profound display of masculine leadership. Jamal beamed, his monumental ego inflating to a dangerous blinding pressure. "It is time to make history." Jamal boomed into the microphone, his voice reaching a fever pitch. "Tonight, my beautiful wife is officially closing out her old life. She has liquidated her downtown properties and all her stock portfolios. She is bringing all her capital into my tech holding company. We are signing the ultimate historic partnership agreement right here on this stage. Give it up for my wife, Nia." The entire banquet hall erupted into a standing ovation. The crowd cheered, fully expecting to see a docile, broken woman shuffle onto the stage in a muted dress to hand over her life savings. The spotlight operator swung the blinding beam of light off the stage, sweeping it rapidly across the dark room until it found me standing motionless by the back doors. The applause instantly faltered. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, spreading from the back tables all the way to the front stage. The bright spotlight hit my tailored all-white power suit. I did not look like the fragile, exhausted victim Jamal had left in our apartment. The razor-sharp cut of the structured shoulders and the aggressively tapered waist screamed absolute, unapologetic authority. The stark, violent contrast of my bold crimson lipstick against the pristine white fabric made me look entirely lethal. I did not look like a submissive wife ready to fall in line. I looked like a corporate assassin arriving to execute a hostile takeover. I stepped away from the wall. I walked forward with slow, deliberate precision. The sea of fake investors, greedy relatives, and stunned fraternity brothers practically parted for me. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, the sound cutting through the stunned silence of the room like the ticking of a metronome. I kept my posture rigidly straight, my chin held high, maintaining a cold, predatory stare directed entirely at the man on the stage. Jamal watched me approach, a fleeting look of genuine confusion crossing his face. His smile faltered as he took in the aggressive, commanding nature of my wardrobe change. He clearly recognized that something was wrong, but the cheering crowd and the intoxicating high of his own hubris quickly smoothed over his panic. He recovered his smile, stepping to the edge of the stage and reaching his hand down to help me up the stairs. I completely ignored his outstretched hand. I stepped up onto the platform under my own power, my eyes fixed firmly on the small cocktail table positioned perfectly under the center spotlight. Jamal laughed nervously into the microphone, attempting to play off my cold rejection as an act of powerful independence. "Let us show them how a real power couple operates," he announced. Though his voice lacked its previous booming authority, I stepped up to the microphone, completely ignoring his presence. I placed my pristine white leather clutch onto the cocktail table. I snapped the gold clasp open. The room went dead silent, a heavy, breathless anticipation hanging over the hundreds of guests. I reached inside the clutch and pulled out the thick premium bond document. I laid the trap flat on the table, placing a heavy, solid silver fountain pen right next to it. Jamal leaned in, His smile strained, but his eyes locked entirely on the silver pen. He gestured toward the document, whispering under his breath for me to just sign the damn paper and play along. The heat of the center spotlight beat down on my shoulders, illuminating the crisp, aggressive lines of my white suit. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. The fake investors, the high society church members, and the rowdy fraternity brothers were all waiting in absolute silence for the climax of his patriarchal fantasy. They wanted to see the wealthy broken woman surrender her financial sovereignty to the brilliant tech titan. I picked up the silver pen. I rolled its heavy metallic weight between my fingers, feeling the cool metal against my skin. I looked down at the signature line, then looked directly into Jamal's eyes. The sheer, blinding arrogance in his expression was intoxicating, knowing I was about to completely shatter his reality and reduce his fabricated empire to ash. I did not uncap the pen. Instead, I let it drop flat onto the cocktail table with a sharp, resonant clink that echoed perfectly through the silent room. I reached out and pulled the microphone firmly from the stand. Jamal flinched, reaching a hand out to stop me, his polished veneer cracking for a fraction of a second. I stepped smoothly out of his grasp, pivoting my body to face the massive audience. I looked up toward the darkened balcony at the very back of the banquet hall. Desmond was standing perfectly still in the shadows, an invisible sentinel overseeing the execution. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. The massive digital projector screens flanking the main stage instantly flared to life. The upbeat, atmospheric gala music cut out with a harsh, grating screech that made several guests physically jump in their seats. The screens did not show Jamal's sleek corporate logo or the stylized branding of his fake tech empire. Instead, towering 20-foot-tall images of heavily redacted financial documents illuminated the dark room. The harsh white glare of bank statements, federal tax liens, and official eviction notices bathed the audience in a cold, unforgiving light. The crowd gasped in unison, a wave of profound confusion rippling through the extravagant banquet hall. Jamal spun around his jaw, dropping open as he stared up at the screens. He saw his own name plastered across the top of a final notice from the Internal Revenue Service. He saw the highlighted negative balances of his shell accounts glaring in bold red ink. His perfectly manicured tech titan persona began to disintegrate in real time. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous room, completely devoid of the submissive, breathless wife tone I had weaponized for weeks. It was cold, sharp, and brutally clear. My husband was absolutely right about one thing, I announced, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd like a surgical blade. A successful man does need a strong foundation to build his empire. But let me be perfectly clear with everyone in this room tonight. The man standing on this stage has built his entire kingdom on a foundation of theft, deceit, and aggressive federal fraud. I gestured toward the towering screens walking the captivated audience through the financial slaughterhouse displayed behind me. I pointed out the massive unregulated wire transfers. I highlighted the defaulted corporate loans and the forged vendor invoices. I exposed the absolute lie of his tech startup, revealing to the entire room that the only disruptive technology Jamal had mastered was laundering stolen child support funds through offshore Caribbean accounts. I stripped away the illusion of his wealth, exposing the rented tuxedos, the leased lifestyle, and the hollow shell of his corporate identity. The fraternity brothers in the back stopped cheering, their premium liquor suddenly forgotten. The fake investors immediately began shifting awkwardly, pulling out their phones and stepping away from the tables, desperate to distance themselves from a public financial massacre. Jamal lunged toward me, his face twisted in raw animalistic panic. He reached desperately for the microphone, hissing that I was ruining everything, demanding that I cut the digital feed. Before his fingers could even brush the sleeve of my blazer, two towering, broad-shouldered security contractors Desmond had hired stepped out from the wings. They moved with terrifying speed, firmly intercepting him before he could cross the stage. They clamped their heavy hands onto his shoulders, physically restraining him on his own platform. He struggled helplessly, his expensive tuxedo twisting around his frame, completely neutralized and forced to stand there while I burned his kingdom to the ground. I turned my back on my thrashing husband and walked to the very edge of the stage. I looked directly down into the crowd, locking my eyes onto the premium center table where Brenda and Keisha sat frozen in absolute horror. Brenda was clutching her massive diamond tennis necklace, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Keisha had dropped her luxury SUV keys onto the silk tablecloth, her aggressive, entitled posture entirely deflated by the towering federal tax liens displayed on the screens above. I addressed them directly over the booming sound system, ensuring that every high society church member at their table heard every single word. I told them that their relentless consuming greed had made my job incredibly easy. I reminded them of the documents they had so eagerly signed in my living room just 2 days ago. I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn behind Brenda's panicked eyes. They thought they were signing standard non-disclosure agreements to protect their exclusive access to my personal wealth. They thought they were securing their permanent spot on the gravy train, guaranteeing themselves a lifetime of luxury funded by my assets. I let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I told them they should have actually read the fine print before putting pen to paper. I explained to the silent captive audience that those documents were not non-disclosure agreements. They were legally binding, irrevocable commercial guarantor transfers. I looked Brenda dead in the eye, my expression hardening into absolute zero, and delivered the lethal blow. "You wanted my money so badly. You signed whatever I put in front of you," I stated, my voice echoing like thunder across the banquet hall. "Brenda, Keisha, you are now the sole legal owners of Jamal's bankrupt fraudulent shell companies. You owe the IRS $4.2 million. A collective murmur of shock and disgust swept through the high society church members sitting at their table. Women who had been praising Brenda's necklace mere minutes ago began physically pulling their chairs away from her. The banquet hall erupted. People were shouting in shock, the atmosphere shifting from a glamorous celebration to a chaotic crime scene. But I was not finished. The trap had to be completely sprung. I had to salt the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. I looked down at Keisha, whose eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. She was staring at me as if I were a ghost. I told her that the luxury SUV she had been bragging about all night, the car she thought proved her elevated status, was financed through the very shell company she now legally owned. Because the company was in total catastrophic default, the bank had executed an immediate repossession order. I informed her that exactly an hour ago, a heavily armed tow truck had arrived at the valet parking garage downstairs and legally confiscated her vehicle. She had absolutely nothing to drive home. Then I turned my executioner's gaze back to Brenda. I signaled Desmond again. The massive screens behind me shifted, projecting the final devastating document. It was a formal, expedited notice of foreclosure. I explained to the room that Jamal had used his mother's suburban house as collateral for a high-risk, predatory corporate loan just to fund the deposit for this very gala. Because the loan had defaulted, and the commercial guarantor paperwork had officially transferred the primary liability directly to her, the bank had executed an accelerated foreclosure protocol. I told Brenda, my voice merciless and flat, that the locks on her beautiful suburban house had been drilled out and changed by bank contractors at exactly 7 o'clock this evening. All her expensive furniture, her clothes, and her belongings were currently locked inside a property she no longer legally possessed. She had no car, no home, and a multi-million-dollar federal tax debt hanging over her head. The facade of wealth evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but absolute devastation. Brenda let out a high-pitched, breathless gasp that echoed audibly over the ambient noise of the crowd. Her eyes rolled completely back into her head. Her hands released the diamond necklace as her entire body went limp. She slumped forward completely, fainting, her face collapsing directly into a catered platter of roasted salmon. The church ladies screamed in genuine panic, scrambling out of their chairs and knocking over champagne flutes to avoid her falling body. Seeing her mother collapse was the spark that ignited Keisha. She completely snapped. A primal, guttural scream of raw fury ripped from her throat. She kicked her chair backward with such violent force that it crashed into the neighboring table, shattering crystal glasses. She launched herself toward the stage, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She was practically foaming at the mouth, her hands curled into rigid fists, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was going to kill me. She did not even make it to the first step of the stage platform. 3 heavy-set venue security guards intercepted her in the middle of the main aisle. They wrapped their thick arms around her waist and shoulders, violently dragging her backward away from the stage. Keisha thrashed like a wild animal, kicking her legs into the air, her sequined dress riding up as she fought desperately to break free. She spat curses and venom, her manicured nails clawing uselessly at the guards restraining her. The crowd gasped and shouted in a chaotic chorus. The absolute destruction of the family's public image was complete. Cell phones immediately rose into the air as hundreds of guest investors and former friends recorded the spectacular, catastrophic downfall of Jamal's fraudulent dynasty. The flashes of phone cameras lit up the banquet hall like strobe lights, immortalizing the exact moment the fake empire collapsed into dust. I stood at the edge of the stage, untouchable in my white suit, watching the chaos unfold with cold, calculated satisfaction. Jamal finally snapped out of his paralyzing shock. He realized the security guards gripping his shoulders were not his loyal fraternity brothers or the venue staff he had hired to protect his image. He wrenched his shoulder forward with sudden violent force, using his sheer size to break one arm free from the guard's grasp, just long enough to lunge across the wooden platform. He grabbed the heavy microphone stand I had left near the center of the stage, yanking the microphone to his mouth. His face was slick with a thick layer of desperate sweat, his eyes darting frantically across the sea of horrified faces. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger at my immaculate white suit and shouted into the sound system that everyone needed to remain absolutely calm. He told the stunned banquet hall that there was a perfectly logical, tragic medical explanation for this entire display. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with manufactured, sickening sympathy, and declared that his wife was suffering from a severe, undocumented schizophrenic episode. He played the exact medical card Moesha had spent years fabricating. He claimed I had stopped taking my heavy psychiatric medication weeks ago, and that the stress of the corporate gala had triggered a violent paranoid delusion. He pleaded with the audience, actively painting himself as the deeply devoted, tragic husband dealing with a profoundly unstable woman who was currently experiencing a complete, dangerous break from reality. He turned toward the venue staff hovering near the kitchen doors and aggressively ordered them to call an ambulance instead of the police. He shouted that I needed to be institutionalized immediately for my own safety before I hurt someone or destroyed his legitimate businesses. He begged his fraternity brothers to help secure the room, trying to rally his old allies to forcefully remove me from the stage. For a few agonizing seconds, the crowd wavered. The sheer conviction in his voice and the heavy societal stigma around mental illness caused a ripple of terrible uncertainty to wash through the room. People looked from his desperate, pleading face to my rigid, immaculate posture, unsure of who to believe. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to shout over his pathetic, calculated performance. I stood my ground, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. I simply looked up at the darkened balcony and gave Desmond the second fatal signal. The massive digital screens behind Jamal flickered with a sharp electronic hiss. The towering federal tax liens and brutal eviction notices vanished instantly, replaced by massive high-definition screenshots of private, heavily encrypted text messages. The bright, unforgiving white light of the screens illuminated Jamal's sweating face from behind as the crowd collectively gasped at the brand-new evidence. I calmly walked over to the backup microphone resting on the DJ's podium at the edge of the stage. I looked directly at Jamal and told him that his medical defense was incredibly unoriginal and deeply insulting. I instructed the captivated audience to read the screens. Displayed in towering, undeniable text were the exact explicit exchanges between my husband and my mother. I narrated the dark timeline for the dead silent room. I broke down the exact financial anatomy of their vile conspiracy. I read the specific time-stamped text message where Moesha offered Jamal a flat, untraceable fee of $500,000 to marry me, systematically isolate me from the outside world, and secure total legal guardianship over my medical decisions before my 30th birthday. The crowd read the brutal messages in real time. They saw Jamal aggressively negotiating his price, demanding luxury cars and immediate cash deposits. They saw him complaining about having to pretend to love me, mocking my quiet nature and my career. They saw the actual bank transaction receipts confirming the initial $50,000 wire transfer Moesha had sent him the morning after our wedding. Every single word of their transactional predatory relationship was laid completely bare for his fraternity brothers, his fake investors, and his high society church congregation to consume. The illusion of his powerful tech empire and our perfect loving marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The hesitant murmurs of the crowd instantly turned into a loud, undeniable roar of absolute revulsion. Jamal dropped the microphone, the heavy piece of equipment crashing onto the wooden stage with a deafening metallic thud. He stared up at the screens, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he read his own damning words projected 20 feet high. I turned my absolute focus away from the broken man on the stage. I looked directly up into the elevated velvet VIP booth where Moesha sat entirely frozen in the shadows. The spotlight operator, sensing the dramatic shift in the room's attention, immediately swung the blinding beam of light directly onto her booth. She flinched violently, throwing a manicured hand up to shield her face from the harsh, exposing glare, but she was entirely trapped. The entire banquet hall physically turned to look at the woman I was about to dissect. I looked at her, my voice carrying a lethal, echoing finality through the massive surround sound speakers. I told the room exactly who this woman was. I told them she was not a grieving, a supportive widow, or a brilliant silent investor. I looked my mother directly in the eye and delivered the absolute devastating truth. "You did not raise me, Moesha," I stated, my voice ringing out with terrifying clarity and crushing weight. "You drugged me to steal from a dead man." The room erupted in shocked, visceral shouts. Several women in the front row physically covered their mouths in horror. I laid out her entire meticulous psychological operation for the crowd. I exposed the forged psychiatric evaluations she had bought with dirty money. I detailed the heavy, dangerous antipsychotics she had secretly ground into my food to keep me docile and compliant. And I revealed the massive $45 million trust fund from my deceased father she was attempting to illegally seize by having me declared mentally incompetent. I explained exactly how she had weaponized the medical system to paint me as a violent lunatic, purely to gain total control over an empire she had absolutely no right to touch. Moesha scrambled backward in the plush velvet booth, knocking over her tall crystal flute of imported champagne. The golden liquid spilled rapidly across the glass table, dripping down onto her expensive designer silk blouse. She desperately grabbed her heavy leather handbag and tried to rush toward the private exit at the very back of the VIP suite, hoping to slip out into the service hallway. But the heavy wooden door was already blocked. Two towering federal agents wearing dark suits and earpieces stepped out of the shadows, crossing their arms and completely blocking her only avenue of escape. Moshe pressed her back against the glass partition, looking down at the stage with wide, intensely panicked eyes. She realized the crushing gravity of the situation. There was no charm, no maternal manipulation, and no forged medical document that could save her from the absolute reality of a federal indictment. Jamal watched Moesha hit the glass, his primal survival instincts finally overriding his profound state of shock. He turned back to face me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely feral. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at my white suit, his chest heaving with deep, panicked breaths. He shouted over the deafening noise of the furious crowd, his voice cracking with desperate, hollow arrogance. He screamed that I was entirely too late. He yelled that he did not care about the text messages, the IRS liens, or the public humiliation because he already had absolutely everything he needed to ruin me. He frantically reminded me of the document we had signed together in the private VIP suite just an hour before the gala began. He bragged loudly to the horrified audience that he had successfully secured my entire liquidated stock portfolio and my downtown real estate capital. He shouted that the asset transfer was legally binding, perfectly notarized, and that he was leaving this building a multi-millionaire regardless of the catastrophic optical fallout. I let him scream until his voice grew raspy and weak. I let him cling tightly to his absolute pathetic delusion for a few more agonizing seconds. I watched the frantic hope burn in his eyes, believing he had somehow won the ultimate game of chess. Then, moving with excruciating deliberate slowness, I reached into my pristine white leather clutch. I pulled out a perfectly clean, unsigned copy of the exact document he had eagerly signed an hour ago. I held the thick bond paper up high into the blinding white spotlight for everyone to see. I looked at my husband, offering him a smile carved from pure glacial ice. I told him he should really learn to read the fine print before attempting to execute a hostile corporate takeover. I explained to him that the document he and Moshe had signed so quickly in the private suite was not a wealth management transfer. It was not a corporate asset merger, and it certainly did not give him access to a single penny of my father's trust fund. My voice dropped to a cold, devastating tone that sliced perfectly through the dead, silent room. I told him it was a comprehensive, legally binding confession of massive federal bank fraud and international money laundering. I explained that Desmond, working directly with the FBI and the IRS, had meticulously drafted every single page. I told Jamal that we had explicitly buried the exact routing numbers of their Cayman Island shell accounts and their illegal wire transfers right above their signature lines. They had admitted to everything in writing, signing their names in wet ink. Jamal froze entirely, the blood completely draining from his face. His knees visibly buckled, hitting the wooden stage with a dull thud. He looked down at his trembling, empty hands, the horrifying realization crashing over him with the undeniable weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had not signed his way into generational wealth. He had willingly, eagerly signed a verified federal confession. The ultimate trap was perfectly sprung. The checkmate was absolute. The heavy mahogany doors at the absolute back of the banquet hall suddenly exploded open with a deafening, violent crash. The entire crowd spun around in unison as a highly coordinated federal strike team swarmed the room. Desmond walked at the exact center of the tactical formation, radiating quiet, lethal authority. He was flanked by Special Agent Reynolds and Investigator Hayes, leading 24 heavily armed FBI and IRS agents directly onto the killing floor. The agents moved with terrifying, calculated precision, instantly securing all exits and establishing absolute control over the chaotic, glittering room. Agent Reynolds marched straight down the center aisle, completely ignoring the stunned fraternity brothers and the terrified church ladies who scrambled out of his way. He stepped onto the stage, grabbed Jamal by the collar of his custom midnight blue tuxedo, and violently slammed him face first onto the polished wooden floor. The sharp, metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly through the microphone that still lay on the stage. Jamal did not fight back. He simply laid there sobbing uncontrollably, his tears soaking into the wood as his entire fraudulent kingdom collapsed around him. Simultaneously, a tactical squad breached the elevated velvet VIP booth. Moesha tried to scream, but Investigator Hayes swiftly forced her arms behind her back, locking her wrists in cold steel. They marched her down the velvet staircase and dragged her directly to the front of the stage. The entire high society crowd, Brenda's church friends and Jamal's fraternity brothers, watched in absolute, horrified silence as the two master manipulators were publicly paraded as common federal criminals. Moesha looked up at me, her flawless makeup smeared with panicked, ugly tears. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, desperate expression of a cornered animal. She fell to her knees at the edge of the stage, ignoring the harsh grip of the federal agents. She looked up at my pristine white suit and began to beg. She pleaded for mercy, her voice cracking as she invoked the sacred bond of our bloodline. She cried out that she was my mother, that family had to forgive each other, and that she had only done these things to ensure our survival. She begged me to call off the federal dogs in the name of family. I looked down at the woman who had drugged me, gaslit me, and tried to steal my mind. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the silent banquet hall with chilling, absolute finality. I am breaking the generational curse. You are no longer my family. I nodded to Agent Reynolds. He hauled Jamal to his feet, reading him his Miranda rights, loudly enough for the entire room to hear. The agents marched Jamal and Moshe down the center aisle, parading them past the flashing camera phones of the stunned audience. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate permanently. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating for everyone who had tried to consume my wealth. The federal prosecutors did not offer plea deals. They used the flawless signed confession documents Desmond had meticulously drafted to secure immediate maximum convictions. Moishe was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for criminal conspiracy, medical fraud, and international money laundering. She lost her designer clothes, her offshore accounts, and her freedom permanently reduced to a federal inmate number. Jamal was sentenced to 10 hard years in federal prison. The moment the FBI indictment went public, his beloved Kappa fraternity officially stripped him of his letters, permanently excommunicating him and erasing his name from their national registry. He was completely disowned by the very network he had used to build his fake empire. Brenda and Keisha faced a completely different kind of absolute ruin. Because I had legally transferred the ownership of Jamal's bankrupt shell companies to them, they were held entirely liable for the massive federal tax debt. The IRS aggressively seized every single asset they possessed. Brenda's beautiful suburban home was auctioned off by the bank. Keisha's luxury SUV was sold to cover a fraction of their penalties. They were left completely bankrupt, their credit scores decimated, and their social standing entirely eradicated. Brenda's high society church community immediately shunned them, refusing to associate with convicted federal tax evaders. The last I heard, Brenda and Keisha were living in a cramped, heavily stained single room at a discount motel on the industrial edge of the city, fighting over food stamps and blaming each other for their total destitution. As for me, the darkness was finally over. 3 weeks after the gala, I turned 30. I walked into my primary wealth management firm completely free of any medical guardianship claims or fraudulent spousal oversight. I sat across from my executive broker and officially signed the final release documents. My father's $45 million trust fund was immediately executed and transferred directly into my private, heavily encrypted accounts. I had successfully protected my legacy, surviving the viper's nest through absolute discipline and lethal strategy. I did not just sit on the wealth. I used my experience, my capital, and my newfound power to build an empire of my own. I launched a highly aggressive, elite financial literacy and legal defense firm specifically designed to protect vulnerable women from predatory men and toxic family members. I hired Desmond as my chief security officer, building a team of ruthless attorneys and forensic accountants who specialized in dismantling financial abusers. We became the absolute nightmare for any con artist trying to steal generational wealth. I stepped out onto the expansive, sun-drenched balcony of my new multi-million-dollar estate. The massive property overlooked the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean, a fortress of solitude, peace, and absolute financial invincibility. The coastal breeze caught the fabric of my silk robe, the warm sunlight washing over my face, as I looked out at the endless, brilliant blue horizon. I rested my hands on the glass railing, feeling the cool, solid reality of everything I had fought to secure. I looked directly into the camera, breaking the fourth wall with a sharp, knowing smile. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood is just the bait used to bleed you dry. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to save your own life? Share your story in the comments, hit like and subscribe, and remember, never let anyone dictate your worth.